Hello there, this is a tutorial on how to export parts for my mod Saber Forge for Beat Saber. If you don't know what any of that means, probably not the right video for you. We're going to make some assumptions that you know generally how to use a 3D editing tool, whether that's Maya or Blender. I'm going to use Maya because that's what I've got, but anything will be fine. Also that you know a little bit how to use Unity. If you've ever exported anything for a Beat Saber mod before, like a custom saber or a custom note, then that'll make this a bit easier. And if any of that doesn't make any sense, then you probably want to look at other tutorials first. So to begin, we have 4 parts make up a custom saber for Saber Forge. That's your blade, your guard, your handle, and your pommel. And those 4 parts can be exported separately. So you can just make blades if you want, just make guards, or you can make several different pieces. And in order to export them, you need to make sure they're set up with this reference guide in mind. And one of the most important things is making sure the pivot position is correct. So for a blade, pivot position needs to be at the base. So with the Z-axis going this way, it needs to be there where it will connect with the handle and the guard. Guard, it can be in the center of the object. Handle, it wants to be at the top where it's going to connect with the blade. And the pommel, it's going to connect with the top of the handle, so it wants to be at this end. And in Maya, you'll see that looks like this, with the pivot point being at the bottom of the blade in that case. And the reason for this is just so that if we're scaling things, as Saber Forge scales the different parts, they'll scale from the right place. If you don't set up the pivots correctly, then they won't be placed correctly on the object. So that's perhaps one of the most important things to get set up right. The other thing is to make sure they're roughly the right size. So I've got some guidelines to the size here. The blade wants to be 0.95 units long or thereabouts, so that it will sit right and the player will know where the end of the saber is. The handle wants to be 0.22, and that's so that it will sit neatly between the guard and the pommel. On the other bits, we want to make sure that their radius is roughly, I've put on the guide, 0.018 units, so that if you see how the guard here in the middle, that's slightly larger than the handle and the blade, so it covers up the junction neatly. If you made it too small, it wouldn't, or if you, let's say, this was like that, then obviously you would see sort of an awkward transition between the two things. So those are just some guidelines. Obviously, if you want to do your own thing and you've got some way of making these look better, feel free. The other thing is UVs. Now, not a lot of the textures use UVs at the moment, but some do, and so it's useful just in order to make sure that you're being consistent with other parts. You set up the UVs. So in this blade, for example, the left and right here are looping. So if you've got a texture, maybe like a scrolling like pattern or something, as some of the textures do, it will scroll from left to right correctly and wrap around the blade. And there's just a rough guide as to how they should be laid out. So for example, let's say someone wanted to make a rainbow pattern that covered the entire saber. If you follow these UVs, it will be correctly mapped. Obviously, if you put the handle UVs right up the top, then it wouldn't be. So that's a rough guideline as how to do those. And the other thing that's important to set up when you're exporting an individual part is to make sure that, so for example, this handle, there's going to be 3 different materials assigned to it. So there's going to be one for the actual main block of the handle, another one for the glowing lines, and final one for this square place, which is actually going to hold a nameplate. So the UVs on that one, just bring up the UV editor again, they don't need to follow that guide, they just need to be, that one quad needs to be nice and square on the UV, so that when you put a nameplate on it will be in the right mapping. So yeah, so we've got 3 different textures there, and materials. And so in order to make sure that we know, or the mod knows how to assign them, we need each material part to be separate, and they need to be parented below another object. So in this case, they're all parented to the actual main piece of the handle. And this will become more clear why we do this when we get into Unity in a minute. And another thing quickly to do, which I recommend doing, is, obviously I've been fiddling around with this, is you want to make sure all the transforms are zeroed off and frozen before we export. And in Maya we also want to delete all the history ideally, so that you won't get any unusual things when we get into Unity. So I'm just going to jump into Unity now. If you're not familiar with exporting sabers, one thing to point out is you do need to have it at Unity version 2018.1.6 F1. If you use a different Unity version, then you may end up with errors. So you need to make sure you download that specific version of Unity, which is what the game is using. And let's have a look. So this is one we've imported earlier, and I've set up this core parts bundle, and this contains several different parts as well as several different materials, and they're all set up like that so that I can export this entire part bundle with all those different objects into Saber Forge, and then these will be put into the different lists that you can flick through in the mod and assign them differently. So just a quick way of how this is set up. Obviously this Unity project will be available with the mod, so you can see how that's put together yourself. But the root parent object, it has a part bundle descriptor asset. This component here is assigned on that, and that contains the basic details of the part bundle, as well as the lists of materials you want to assign with the part bundle. Now you don't need to have materials. You can put one material, you can put no materials, you can have just one blade, for example, on a part bundle, or you can have a huge list as I've got here. Now obviously it makes sense for there to be several parts on each bundle, because it makes it less fiddly for a player to install. So a vague recommendation is to make sure you combine, if you've got a lot of parts you want to export, you combine them all into one part bundle. So in this case you want to put that component on there, and you want to give it a name. You would put your author's name in here, and with putting the names on the part bundles as well as individual parts, try and keep them unique. If you have conflicting names, it can cause errors with the mod. Sorry. So again, we're going to look at these again in a second, but there's a part descriptor that goes on each individual part, and again you want an individual name, one that's not going to get confused with the names in your bundle. So firstly, let's have a quick look at assigning materials. So these will all be exported into the game, and they'll be put in a list for the player to flick through. And we've got 4 different lists. We've got the glow materials, secondary materials, trail materials, and the nameplate materials. So the glow materials, fairly self-explanatory. It's the glowing parts of the blade and any other glowing parts on the object. So if you make any materials, so I'll just show you some of the materials I've made that are glowing. So we've got this one, which has got a scrolling texture, a few Fresnel sort of rim light effects on there. So those are all in that list. Not going to go too much into materials now, but because, as I showed you with the UVs, they have to be a little bit stretched so they loop. So for the tiling, you probably want them to be, this has got a 1:6 ratio or a 1:8 ratio, because if it's a 1:1 ratio on the tiling, then they end up looking a bit like that. So that's a quick tip for making sure your textures wrap like nicely around there. And the other lists we've got, so secondary materials, that contains some of the other things like metallic shaders are on the secondary things, and they're the things that are going to be assigned to the detail on the handle and the guards, for example. So obviously I'm just assigning like that. Doesn't really matter what they've got assigned on Unity because they'll be replaced in the mod. But as a rule of thumb, we want, this will become more obvious in a second. We want anything that's going to be metallic, or part of the guard material, I should say, needs to be in the secondary list. So does anything dark or kind of matte or something like that you want the player to be putting on their handles. And just going back to these material lists, you've also got trail materials, which will be allowing to assume their trail, and you've also got nameplates, which are a very specific kind of material, and they allow people to have a custom name. And I'm looking to ways as maybe the individual players might be able to put just a texture without going through Unity that will be immediately loaded in via the mod, but for now you have to create an individual texture to go along like that. So as I was showing before, the UVs on this are wrapped specifically for this nameplate texture, and if you've got any of those, they go in the nameplate materials box there. Also to note, the forge prop here, you don't need to bother with that. That's just for the core parts, which are essential to the mod, and they contain this bit of furniture, which is just a nice decoration for the mod, so don't worry about that. It's a particular box there. So just to demonstrate an individual part now, individual parts need this component, which is a part descriptor, distinct from part bundle descriptor goes on the whole bundle. Part descriptor goes on an individual part, and this, as I showed you before, needs a unique name. You need to assign the type, in this case a guard. And this is the bit that I was talking about earlier, where we're assigning our individual objects, because as you can see there's a couple of individual sub-objects on this part. So we've got that bit there, which is the actual nameplate texture, and that needs to be assigned into the nameplate box, so it needs to be dragged onto that list there. And the main part needs to be dragged onto there. And again, if I show you another example, so this blade, the blade object itself, the blade mesh, needs to be on the glow materials box, and this blade detail part, which is just a little bit near the hilt, that needs to be dragged onto the secondary material object. Now you notice that on here we've got glow materials, secondary materials, trail and nameplate. On the individual parts we've also got tertiary materials. Now what's that? Well, the best way to explain this is if we let's bring up this handle. Now this has got secondary materials. Now in this case, the parts that are going to be the secondary material are these metallic bits in Unity, not necessarily metallic in the game, and the tertiary materials, the actual handle itself, the black bit here. Now the reason there's two channels is because it allows the player then to swap the textures separately between the handle bit there and the detailing on there. And as a general rule, the main part of a handle, so like the grip for example, should go on the tertiary channel, and any detail on the handle or any parts of the guards or pommels should go on the secondary bit, so that what you end up with is, so let's hide this one, and so that in the actual mod the guards will be the same texture, the same material as this detail, but there'll be separate material for the handle there, the grip. And if you set that up correctly, it will give players a bit more flexibility in different materials they can change. They can separate these two different materials out, and then they'll also be able to change that nameplate as I showed if you've set up a specific object. One more thing to note as well is if you don't put any of your these sub-objects onto these, for example, if I was to just put these all as 0, then when I exported it, it would actually export these materials from Unity with it. So if you didn't want to use the materials in Saber Forge, for example, you had a specific material you wanted to be on this blade, you could just leave nothing in these lists here, and then when you got into the game, players wouldn't be able to change from your material. So if you made a very specific part for a person who wanted a specific texture, or if it was supposed to be a replica of a an actual fantasy weapon, you might want a specific texture. So that's how you would do that. One little thing that's worth showing you as well is so this guard here, that's just in the middle of the saber there. But say you wanted to create a guard that did that and was went over the entire hand, and it connects with the back of the handle there. Just make sure you tick this box is finger guard, and the reason for that is it just makes sure it will scale properly in Saber Forge. If you don't do that, then it won't know to do this if someone changes the length of the handle. I think that's covered more or less everything regards setting up your individual part bundle. So let's just go through quickly creating a new one. So we create a new empty game object, we'd assign a part bundle, we'd give it a name and an author. Then if we went to our models, and then we've imported all these models from Maya, we stick those underneath it, and then for each object in here, each individual part, we add part descriptor, we assign all the parts correctly, so in this case the detail goes in that channel, give it a name, set up its type, and then once you've done all that, if I was to go through all these and set them up as I've done in the core parts, go through every pommel for example and give that a part descriptor. Once you've done that and you're all happy with that, you would go to your part exporter window, which is part exporter. Now if you've exported any sabers, this will look very similar. So saber exporter from custom sabers. So it's window, part exporter, and then that will show you any bundles that you've created. So we've got the core parts one, which is the one that I've already set up, and this new one which I'm in the process of setting up, and it'll take the name and the author from there. You click export, and it needs to be placed in Beat Saber folder, Saber Forge assets, and your name, and export it. If it's successful, give it a couple of seconds. Exporting complete. There you go, and that should work in the game if you've set it up correctly, of course. So I think that's covered everything. If you've got any questions, obviously you can ask them below, and you can also contact me on the Beat Saber modding Discord if you've got any other questions. Hope that covers everything. Great, thank you very much.